Hey, I wanted to follow up on my last video where I was kind of leaving things, watch the last video for context, talking about healthy hierarchy, the difference between healthy and unhealthy hierarchy. So most of us have kind of see hierarchy in a bit of a negative connotation. In my last video, I was talking about that the basis for all healthy relationships is a mutual reciprocity. And there is such a thing, I believe, as a healthy hierarchy. And when I say healthy hierarchy, I'm simply describing phenomenologically the coherent structure that exists at different levels of scale of organization when different people in a system have different roles that allow that system to function properly. So the hierarchy of power exists because of dependency. And obviously when a woman becomes a mother and has a child and becomes financially dependent on a man, the man has a certain amount of power, similar to the way the mother has a certain amount of power over the child because the child is dependent on her. And in order for this power not to be abused, in other words, in order for the systemic structure to work properly and to flow coherently in a regenerative manner, there has to be mutual reciprocity. And what this means, as I outlined in the last video, is that the respect flows upwards to those who are being depended upon as an automatic response to the cherishing of the sacredness of the vulnerable dependency that those who are so-called lower the position that they're in. And the position that they're in is a structural position, but an unhealthy patriarchy or hierarchy will basically abuse that dependency with a power over structure that over extracts and misuses the power by placing a value judgment on those who are lower down. In other words, making them less valuable. And this is the way that wealth is accumulated. This is the way that the structure is abused, and essentially wealth is funneled upwards. And there's a very interesting history from the book, The Caliban and the Witch, that describes very specifically how women's dependency on men for resources is a fairly recent phenomena. Up until the 1400s, men and women both mutually relied upon the natural resources that were available in the commons. So the commons were owned by the lords during feudalism, but both men and women had equal access to these resources that they could procure and use for their livelihoods. Women were parts of guilds and businesses and made money in commerce, and they were not resigned to the home. They were not stuck in the role of stay-at-home housewife. That's not something that has always been women's fate. That's a fairly recent phenomena, and that phenomena occurred alongside the rise of capitalism and the merchant class in the 14 and 1500s, as the commons were privatized and basically enclosed. So there was something called the enclosures. And the enclosures is basically when these access to common lands was eliminated, and there was widespread homelessness. Older women were the most affected, and this is basically when during the rise of capitalism, the witch trials also occurred. Now, I don't know if here is the right place to go into all of that, because this book I've had to read very slowly. I have not finished it because it's been one of the most difficult pieces of history I've ever read to stomach. And I've spent the past few years studying nutrition primarily and physiology, and less time studying history. But this book has really hit me in the solar plexus in a really heavy-duty way to understand the mechanism and the means by which patriarchy ushered capitalism in, and how the witch trials were a necessary way to usher capitalism in and to terrorize women through an act of genocide, and the way that this also corresponded with and correlated with colonialism and slavery in the United States. So that history is intense, but all of this is just to say that when the problem with an unhealthy hierarchy is one in which there is no mutual reciprocity of cherishing for those who are dependent, or who are providing the resources, or really providing the power. Because if you don't have anyone dependent upon you, you don't really have power, right? So the people who have power need those who are dependent to even be higher up, right? And so what I want to talk about here, rather than going into the history, is to recognize that mutual reciprocity in relationship through mutual respect that is expressed as cherishing to those who are dependent, and the natural automatic looking up to and respect that those who are dependent have for those who have more power, who act with integrity in that power. That's a regenerative system. And that's a regenerative system that is regenerative because it is not a hierarchical system based in a devaluation of any part of the system. The functioning of the system is based on an understanding of the value of all of the parts. And this kind of goes back to family constellation therapy, where everyone belongs, everyone has a part. Now, obviously, in a patriarchal system or an extractive capitalistic system, the part that is dependent, the part that has less power, is actually extraordinarily valuable, because that's where the value can be siphoned off to the extent that there is no mutual reciprocity. So the free resources from Mother Nature that are utilized in capitalism to generate wealth, and the free labor of women in the home providing labor that is unpaid, is the basis for the wealth of everyone else. And there is no other way that is actually probably the reason why it is so difficult to break out of this hierarchical, patriarchal, money-based capitalistic system, is because it is a self-reinforcing feedback loop that generates wealth for a few who obviously would not want to give that up, right? And so we need to ask ourselves why this gender divide needs to be healed. The reason is because we need a more even distribution of wealth in order to create a society that has less tyranny and that is actually regenerative and not overly extractive. And men and women getting on the same page and on the same team is absolutely critical to that. In fact, men and women uniting together and working together as a unified front in a family is the core, most revolutionary act that can occur, which is precisely the reason why when feudalism was transitioning into capitalism during the enclosures, when the commons was being privatized, the primary tactic that was used, besides burning women alive, was to divide men and women. And the way that men and women were divided, since they were previously posing a great threat to the status quo in their united front in trying to overturn these changes, the primary strategy that was used was that the church legalized gang rape. The church legalized gang rape. When this was implemented and the sexual weakness of men allowed for an enormous divide to occur between the sexes by way of men's willingness to utilize the legality of rape, an enormous schism appeared between men and women in the sexes. And from that point on, and probably previous to that point as well, but certainly on a different level and scale, this division of the sexes occurred at this time, and then men and women were too estranged from each other to act as a unified front to overthrow this capitalistic society. There was also rampant prostitution at that time as well, because women were displaced and didn't have a home and didn't have access to the commons for their resources, so they didn't have a means of livelihood. And then women were penalized and criminalized for being prostitutes. So we see this extraordinary level of abuse of the feminine. And I think when we talk about this and we think about how we can heal the gender divide, we have to remember that these histories are not just unpleasant things or inconvenient things that we read about that happened in the past, that are over, that are no longer relevant. These are experiences that happened to the collective of womankind and of mankind that live on in our DNA. In other words, they happen to our ancestors, and we are the living embodiment of our ancestors, and our DNA remembers what happened. So I think we really need to understand on a really, really simple level that history is a living history that lives within us, and that our cells have a cellular memory of things that occurred. In other words, this is not just a mental resentment that women are holding on to as we look at this history. this history actually explains a lot of the deep mistrust that women have towards men, and how large the scale of the reclamation project is. So the rehabilitation happens by way of the cherishing of the sacred divine feminine. And of course that must start with women, because one way that patriarchy has succeeded is it has made people internalize the mechanism of oppression within themselves. So to the extent that women devalue themselves, do not prioritize themselves, do not have functional boundaries, self-sacrifice and self-abandon, all of those are survival mechanisms. There's a book called Patriarchy Stress Disorder, and it talks a lot about how, if you lived in a society in which you could literally be burned alive for practicing birth control, for knowing about herbs, or for speaking against the status quo in any way, then the smartest survival mechanism in a system that tyrannical is to self-abandon and to basically implement patriarchy on your own. And that's the most sophisticated form of programming that a system can have to have a stranglehold on people, is to ensure that they are the ones who implement the programming. So the deprogramming is pretty profound, because it's based in a survival mechanism from a trauma response from widespread genocide that occurred over the course of a few hundred years, and also occurred across different continents in tandem with colonialization. And it occurred in the absence of male protest, as far as we can tell. There's only one documented case of men who actually stopped the women in their village from being burned alive. This was in the southern region of France with the cod fishermen. And there was a very large attempt to burn hundreds and hundreds of women in this one village. And the cod fishermen of southern France, I think this was around in the 1500s, I don't remember the exact date, they were willing to intercept and essentially stop the cod fishing season in order to save their women from this genocide and persecution. And they were successful in halting and stopping the burning of their wives, mothers, and sisters. If more men had done this, capitalism would not have been able to be implemented on this scale. So I really recommend that book, The Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici. It's a communist writing about this very important time period. And I think if we want to understand the gender divide, it's absolutely critical that we understand how and when that happened, and the way that patriarchy and capitalism need each other if we want to dismantle this and come to a more harmonious, loving, and cherishing place between men and women.